The world had crumbled, and all that was left was a haunting silence. Cities lay in ruin, and the once thriving hum of human activity had turned into an eerie quiet. The air was thick with dust and ash, remnants of a society that had ceased to exist. The zombie apocalypse had arrived without warning, tearing through the fabric of civilization like a wildfire, and within months, it had wiped out most of humanity. For those who survived, the days felt endless, each one bleeding into the next. There was no structure, no government, no plan. Just the relentless search for food, shelter, and the ever-present fear of the undead. People had learned to survive alone, forced to fend for themselves in a world that had grown indifferent to their existence. Among these survivors was a man named Daniel. He was a former technician, once content in his quiet apartment in a small town. Now, his life had been reduced to scavenging through abandoned buildings for supplies and hiding from the infected. The loneliness was suffocating. Every day was a battle, not just for survival, but for sanity. Daniel had tried everything to stay connected, hoping against hope that there might be someone, somewhere who was still alive. He had dug through radio frequencies, desperate to hear another human voice, but each attempt had been in vain. The airwaves were filled with nothing but static, the occasional crackle of a dying signal. He had stopped trying to communicate. After all, what was the point? If there was anyone else left, they were probably as alone and hopeless as he was. One evening, as Daniel sat in his makeshift shelter, a small, decaying house on the outskirts of what was once a thriving city, he was fiddling with an old radio he had salvaged. The radio had been a gift from his father, something he had kept for sentimental value. It hadn't worked in years, but in the midst of the chaos, it had become a symbol of the life that had been lost. He had turned the dial aimlessly, half-heartedly hoping for some miracle. Suddenly, a faint voice broke through the static, so soft and distant that Daniel thought he might have imagined it. But there it was again, a voice, crackling through the airwaves. His heart skipped a beat. It was a woman's voice, broken, distorted, but undeniably real. "Is anyone out there?" The voice whispered, barely audible over the static. "Can anyone hear me?" Daniel froze. His mind raced. Could it be? Was it possible that someone else had survived? Someone who wasn't just another infected, wandering the ruins? He adjusted the dials frantically, trying to get a clearer signal, but the static only intensified, swallowing the voice whole. "Please," the voice continued, desperation lacing every word. "If you're out there, please respond. I'm not alone. There are others here. I don't know how long we can last." Daniel's hands shook as he gripped the radio. His heart hammered in his chest. The silence that had surrounded him for so long was being shattered, replaced by the faintest glimmer of hope. For the first time in what felt like years, Daniel wasn't sure whether to believe what he had just heard. It seemed impossible. But he couldn't ignore the pull of that voice, the promise of connection in a world that had long since abandoned such things. He sat there, staring at the radio, his mind racing with 1,000 questions. Who was she? Where was she? Was it a trap? Or was it truly a survivor, just like him, reaching out from the abyss of isolation? The static remained, broken only by the occasional whisper of the woman's voice, now almost inaudible. Before Daniel could make up his mind, the signal disappeared entirely. The radio fell silent once again. The desperate cries of the woman faded, swallowed by the nothingness of the dead world. But Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The echo of her words lingered in his mind. "I'm not alone." He had always thought that he was the only one left, the last man standing in a ruined world. But now, that belief was beginning to crack. There were others out there, people who had survived, just like him. Maybe, just maybe, there was hope after all. The night passed uneventfully, but Daniel couldn't sleep. The encounter with the voice had stirred something in him, a hunger for connection that he hadn't realized he still had. The next morning, he packed up his things and decided that he couldn't just sit idly by anymore. He had to find out if the voice he had heard was real. He couldn't remain in isolation, not when there was a chance, however slim, that he wasn't alone in this world. As he set out, the landscape felt different. The streets, once so familiar, now seemed strange and empty. The world had changed, and so had he. But one thing was certain, he couldn't go back to the solitude he had known. There was something out there waiting for him, and he was going to find it. The journey ahead would be dangerous. He knew that. But for the first time in a long time, Daniel felt something he hadn't felt since before the outbreak: hope. Daniel walked through the crumbling streets, the weight of his backpack a constant reminder of the dangers that lay ahead. The city, once full of life and noise, now stood as a hollow shell, its buildings falling apart, its streets overrun by vegetation. Nature was slowly reclaiming what was once man-made, but the ominous silence in the air made it clear that nothing could ever return to what it once was. The faintest trace of hope that had sparked within him last night kept Daniel moving forward. The voice on the radio had been a lifeline, even if he wasn't sure exactly where it had come from or if it had been real. Regardless, the idea of other survivors had lit a fire in his chest. He couldn't just wait any longer. If there was even a chance of finding someone who wasn't a mindless, rotting corpse, he had to take it. His steps echoed in the empty streets as he passed wrecked cars and abandoned buildings. The air was thick with the smell of decay, not just from the bodies that had littered the earth, but from the buildings themselves, falling apart and crumbling under the weight of time and neglect. It had been over a year since the outbreak, and in that time, the world had essentially stopped. People had died, cities had burned, and the idea of human civilization seemed like a distant memory. As he walked, he kept his eyes peeled for anything that could indicate life. He wasn't sure what he expected, maybe a smoke signal or a faint light through the trees. But the world was still eerily quiet. Occasionally, a rustle of leaves or the distant screech of an animal would break the stillness, but otherwise, it was like stepping into a dead zone. Even the infected were harder to find these days. Most had wandered off into the wilderness, driven by nothing but their hunger. The ones left behind were either too weak to move or had become mindless, wandering in circles, slowly fading away. Despite the lack of immediate danger, Daniel felt a constant sense of unease. The silence was deafening, and even though the world was technically abandoned, there was something unsettling about it. Every shadow seemed to hold a secret, every creak and groan of the buildings hinted at something lurking just beyond sight. Daniel's journey led him through the outskirts of the city, toward the old radio tower he remembered seeing in the distance. He had heard rumors about the tower being a key point for communications during the early days of the outbreak, though he wasn't sure if it still functioned. The idea of the tower seemed promising, especially now that he was holding on to the sliver of hope that the voice from the static was a real person in need of help. After several hours of walking, Daniel reached the tower. It loomed above him, its rusted frame reaching toward the sky like a skeletal hand. It was clear the structure had seen better days, parts of it were crumbling, and a faint buzz emanated from the machinery at its base. But the fact that there was any sort of noise at all made his heart race with anticipation. He approached cautiously, looking around for any signs of life or activity. The area around the tower was overgrown, with wild grasses and vines winding their way through the cracked pavement. The once pristine metal of the tower now bore the scars of time, scratches, dents, and rust had consumed much of its surface. Yet, the hum of the machinery inside it suggested that someone, or something, had been using it. Daniel reached the base of the tower and spotted an old, battered door leading inside. It was half open, as if someone had come and gone without bothering to close it behind them. He hesitated for a moment, then pushed the door open cautiously. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the remnants of long-forgotten days. Broken equipment and empty cans littered the floor. The walls were adorned with faded posters, long since peeled and yellowed by time. The whole place felt abandoned, but the buzz from the machinery remained, like a heartbeat in the middle of a dead world. Daniel took a deep breath and moved further inside. He spotted a small room toward the back of the tower, where the hum of electricity seemed to be coming from. As he entered the room, he saw an old radio, cracked and covered in dust, but still emitting a faint signal. His pulse quickened. Could this be the source of the voice? Was it possible that someone had been hiding here, using this tower as a last bastion of hope? He leaned forward, adjusting the dials carefully, praying to hear that same voice again. Static filled the air, but then, through the noise, the voice returned. "Is anyone still listening? Please, we're running out of time." It was her. The woman from the night before. Her voice was clearer now, but it still crackled with static. There was a sense of urgency in her words, as though she was speaking on borrowed time. "I don't know how much longer we can hold out. There are others here with me. We've been waiting, hoping for help, but I don't know if we'll make it." Daniel's heart raced as he listened, unable to tear himself away from the static. She wasn't just asking for help, she was warning him. Something was wrong. He could sense it in her voice, the desperation that crept into every word. He tightened his grip on the radio's dial, adjusting the frequency, trying to get a clearer connection. But the static continued to blur her words, and just as quickly as it had appeared, her voice faded once again. "Please, if you can hear me." Then, nothing. The radio was silent once again. Daniel sat back, breathing heavily. He had heard her. She was real. But now the questions multiplied. Where was she? Who was she? And why had she reached out? The urgency in her voice was undeniable. He couldn't ignore it. There was someone out there, and he needed to find them before it was too late. With renewed determination, Daniel stood up. The journey was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, he wasn't walking alone anymore. Daniel's heart pounded as he left the tower, the faint memory of the woman's voice still lingering in his mind. There was no time to waste. He couldn't ignore the urgency in her words, or the desperate plea for help. Whoever she was, wherever she was, she needed him. And for the first time since the world had turned upside down, Daniel had a reason to keep moving. The path ahead was unclear, the landscape a mix of overgrown roads, abandoned homes, and empty fields. He had no map to guide him, only the fragmented message that had come through the radio. It wasn't much to go on, but it was something. He clutched the radio in his hands, knowing it might still hold the key to finding her. The journey took him deeper into the wasteland, through towns that had once been bustling hubs of activity. Now, they were nothing more than hollowed-out shells, the remains of humanity's fleeting existence. He passed through shattered storefronts and collapsed buildings, a silent witness to the devastation that had overtaken the world. But each step forward felt like a step away from the isolation he had grown used to, and that kept him moving. The weather had turned, clouds gathering overhead as a storm began to brew. The winds howled, sending dust and debris swirling through the air. Daniel pulled his jacket tighter around him, his face grim as he pressed on. The cold, biting rain soon began to fall, drenching him in its relentless downpour. But he didn't stop. Not for the storm, not for the exhaustion that was beginning to weigh on his legs. He had a mission now, and he couldn't afford to waste time. As the hours dragged on, the landscape began to change. The buildings became fewer, the roads less clear. But Daniel knew that whatever lay ahead, whether it was hope or something worse, he had to reach it. The voice on the radio had given him a glimpse of possibility, and that was enough to keep him going. By the time the storm had passed, Daniel found himself at the edge of a small, deserted town. It looked abandoned, like everything else, but something about it felt different. The streets were eerily quiet, the buildings dark and empty. No signs of life, no signs of the infected. But there was something in the air, a feeling of tension, of something lurking just beyond sight. Daniel paused, scanning the area carefully. The town looked to have been untouched for years, yet there was a feeling that something, or someone, was waiting for him. The quiet was unsettling. It wasn't the peaceful kind of silence that came with a world left to nature's devices. It was the kind of silence that spoke of secrets, of things hidden just out of view. He moved cautiously through the town, his senses heightened. Every creak of the buildings, every whisper of wind felt like it could be a threat. The town was empty, yet Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The silence was almost oppressive, and it made his skin crawl. Still, he pressed on, heading toward what appeared to be an old church at the far end of the town. It had once been a place of gathering, a symbol of faith and community. Now, it was just another crumbling structure, its doors ajar and its windows dark. As he approached the church, Daniel's instincts kicked in. Something was off. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as he carefully stepped inside. The building was dark, the faint light from outside filtering in through broken windows. The floor creaked under his weight, and the air smelled of mildew and decay. It was as though time had forgotten this place, leaving it to rot in the wake of humanity's downfall. He moved deeper into the church, his steps slow and deliberate. His eyes scanned the shadows, looking for any sign of life, or any sign of danger. The silence in the building was suffocating, and as he made his way toward the altar, something caught his attention. A faint glow emanated from a small room off to the side, its door slightly ajar. Without thinking, Daniel moved toward it, his heart racing in his chest. The glow was faint, but it was unmistakable. It was a light, and it was coming from inside. He pushed the door open slowly, the hinges groaning in protest. The room was small, a makeshift shelter in the heart of the church. And there, in the dim light, was a figure, someone huddled in the corner, their back to him. "Hello?" Daniel called softly, his voice echoing through the stillness. The figure turned slowly, revealing a woman's face. She looked tired, her clothes ragged, her hair matted with dirt. But it was her eyes, wide with fear, that sent a chill down Daniel's spine. They were the eyes of someone who had been living in constant fear, someone who had seen too much. The woman's gaze flickered over him, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, until finally, she spoke in a low voice. "Are you real?" she asked, her words filled with disbelief. Daniel took a cautious step forward, his voice steady. "I'm real." "Are you?" She nodded slowly, but there was a tremor in her hands as she reached for a nearby bottle of water. "I didn't think I would see another person again. I thought I was the last one left." Daniel's heart sank as he realized the gravity of her words. The loneliness that had plagued him for so long wasn't unique to him. This woman had suffered the same isolation, the same fear of being forgotten in a world that had moved on without them. "I heard your voice on the radio," Daniel said, his voice softer now. "You're not alone. There are others. I'm here to help." Her eyes widened as if she had heard a lifeline thrown into the abyss. She slowly stood up, her body stiff from lack of movement. "I don't know how long we can last. We've been hiding, trying to stay out of sight, but the infected are getting closer. I don't know how much longer we have." Daniel's pulse quickened. This wasn't just a meeting of survivors, it was the beginning of something far greater. The lost signal had brought them together, but what came next would be the true test of their survival. He wasn't alone anymore, and neither was she. But now, they would have to face the world together. And it was a world that had only one rule: survive at all costs. The woman's name was Ellie, and she wasn't the only one left in the church. As the days stretched on, Daniel learned that a small group of survivors had taken refuge in the abandoned building, huddled together for safety. There were 3 others, each as wary and uncertain as Ellie. They had created makeshift homes within the church, living off what little they could salvage, their days filled with the quiet routine of survival. Ellie had explained how the town, once thriving, had become a trap. The infected had been drawn here by the faint traces of humanity, by the flickers of light and the smell of food. They had tried to flee, but the roads were blocked, and there was nowhere left to run. The church had become their sanctuary, their last place of refuge. As Daniel sat with them around a small fire that crackled weakly in the corner of the church, he felt the weight of their fear pressing down on him. They were trapped. Just like he had been. The walls of this place, which had once been a symbol of faith and safety, now felt like a cage. Ellie sat next to him, her hands wrapped around a mug of water. "We've been trying to keep a low profile," she said, her voice soft but full of the exhaustion of months spent hiding. "The infected seem to be everywhere now. We hear them at night, scraping against the walls, pounding at the doors. It's only a matter of time before they find a way in." Daniel glanced around the room, his eyes landing on the other survivors. There was Tom, a quiet man in his late 30s, who spent most of his time fixing things, anything that might help them survive. Then there was Sarah, a young woman barely out of her teens, whose face had been marked by the horrors of the outbreak. She had been the one to find Daniel when he first arrived, her eyes wide with caution, as though expecting him to be just another threat. The last of the group was Marcus, an older man with graying hair and the look of someone who had lived 100 lifetimes in just a few short months. He said little, but Daniel could tell that the weight of survival had taken its toll on him. There was a weariness in his eyes, a sadness that was hard to ignore. "We're not safe here," Marcus finally spoke, his voice rough from disuse. "The church might have been a good hideout once, but the infected are getting smarter. They're starting to figure out where we are." Daniel knew he couldn't let them stay here. As much as he wanted to believe that the radio signal could lead him to something better, there was no guarantee. But what was certain was that this church, this fragile shelter, would not be enough to protect them much longer. "We need to move," Daniel said, his voice firm with conviction. "The radio signal is coming from the north. I think we should head there, try to find out who's on the other end. We don't have a lot of time." Ellie looked at him with a mix of hope and skepticism. "You really think someone's out there? Someone who can help?" "I don't know," Daniel admitted, his gaze sweeping over the group. "But we've survived this long by holding on to whatever hope we could. And I think this might be the only chance we have." The group fell into a heavy silence as they weighed his words. Tom was the first to speak. "I'll get my things ready. If we're leaving, I'd rather get moving sooner than later." The others nodded, each one rising to gather their belongings. It wasn't an easy decision. For months, they had stayed put, keeping to themselves, hoping the outside world would simply leave them alone. But Daniel's words had stirred something in them, a flicker of hope, fragile as it was. Maybe they weren't as alone as they thought. As the night grew darker and the fire sputtered out, the survivors began to prepare. They gathered what little food they had left, packed up their belongings, and secured the doors. It was a quiet process, each person lost in their thoughts as they prepared for what lay ahead. When morning finally broke, a gray light filtered through the shattered windows of the church, casting long shadows across the room. Daniel stood at the entrance, the cold wind whipping through the cracks in the door. He looked back at the group, their faces filled with apprehension and fear. "Let's go," he said, his voice steady. They stepped out into the empty streets of the town, the silence pressing down on them like a heavy blanket. Daniel led the way, his eyes scanning the horizon for any signs of movement. The world felt even more desolate in the light of day. What had once been a thriving town was now just a memory, reduced to ruins and empty streets. As they walked, the weight of the journey began to settle in. The road ahead was uncertain, and every step felt like a risk. There was no telling what dangers awaited them. The infected could be lurking around any corner, waiting to pounce. And the radio signal, if it even existed, could be miles away, unreachable. But despite the fear, despite the doubt that gnawed at him, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that they were doing the right thing. They had to move. They had to try. The first few miles passed in relative silence. The group kept close, their footsteps soft against the cracked pavement. Every rustle of the wind, every distant noise had them on edge. But as the day wore on, the landscape began to change. The buildings grew sparse, and the trees started to thicken, wrapping the world in a blanket of green. The road twisted through dense woods, and the remnants of civilization grew farther behind them. It was then that they heard it. A distant sound, faint at first, but unmistakable. The low hum of an engine. The group froze, exchanging nervous glances. No one had seen a working vehicle in months. The world had long since stopped moving. But now something was different. "Get down," Daniel hissed, pulling Ellie behind a large boulder. The others quickly followed, crouching low to the ground. The sound of the engine grew louder, and Daniel's heart raced. This wasn't a random vehicle. Whoever was out there was either another survivor, or something far worse. They waited, their breath shallow, the world holding its breath as the sound drew closer. Then, it stopped. The engine's hum had died down, leaving only the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. The group stayed low, hearts pounding in their chests, the silence around them thick with tension. Daniel's mind raced, trying to anticipate what was coming next. The engine had stopped, but the danger wasn't over yet. Whoever was out there could be just as desperate as they were, or worse. "Stay quiet," Daniel whispered, his voice barely audible. He kept his eyes fixed on the path ahead, his fingers clenched around the handle of his makeshift weapon. It was a sturdy branch he had found earlier, but it would have to do. His gaze flickered over to Ellie, who was crouched next to him, her face pale with fear. She nodded once, her lips pressed into a tight line, her eyes locked on the same spot in the distance. Minutes passed, each one feeling like an eternity. The forest around them seemed to hold its breath, the world pausing for just a moment. Daniel's ears strained to catch any sound, footsteps, voices, the rustle of clothing. But all he could hear was the distant chirp of insects and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. Then, finally, they saw it. A figure emerged from the treeline, walking slowly down the road. At first, Daniel couldn't make out the details. The person was tall, wearing a dark coat, with a hood pulled low over their head, obscuring their face. They moved with caution, their steps measured and deliberate, as if they were aware of their surroundings, aware that they were not alone. "Who is that?" Sarah whispered from behind him, her voice trembling. She couldn't seem to stop herself from speaking, her fear too great to be contained. "Stay down," Daniel replied, his voice tight. The last thing they needed right now was to draw attention. The figure paused for a moment, standing still in the middle of the road, as though listening for something. The silence stretched, the world around them feeling impossibly still. For a few seconds, Daniel's heart stopped in his chest. Was the person looking for them? Had they heard something? Then, the figure began to move again, continuing down the road, seemingly unaware of the group hiding just off to the side. Daniel waited until they were a safe distance away before he slowly stood, signaling for the others to follow. His breath was shallow, his body tense with the adrenaline of the encounter. "Let's move," he said quietly, and the group quickly fell into step behind him. They moved with urgency now, trying to put as much distance between themselves and the mysterious figure as possible. But the tension still hung in the air, the question of who that person was, and whether they could be trusted, lingering at the back of Daniel's mind. They didn't have to go far before they spotted another sign of life. The road ahead curved, and as they rounded the bend, a large, rusted truck came into view, parked off to the side. The truck looked weathered, its tires half sunken into the dirt, but it was unmistakably functional. There were patches of dried mud along its sides, and a few belongings were scattered around it, cans, water bottles, and a few makeshift bags. The truck had clearly been here for a while. But who did it belong to? Was it the same person who had just passed by, or was there someone else nearby? Daniel felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He motioned for the group to stay back as he cautiously approached the vehicle. His heart pounded in his chest with each step, the sound of his boots crunching the gravel underfoot the only noise that seemed to matter in that moment. As he reached the truck, he peered inside through the cracked window. It was empty, no signs of life, no blood, nothing to indicate any immediate danger. Still, Daniel hesitated. The truck was a lifeline. It could be their ticket to survival. But it could also be a trap, a false hope designed to lure in the desperate. He glanced back at the others, who were waiting behind him, their eyes wide with anticipation. Ellie was the first to speak. "Should we check it out?" Daniel thought for a moment, then nodded. "We don't have much of a choice. But be careful." The group spread out, cautiously moving toward the truck. They checked the immediate area for any signs of life, weapons, or traps. Nothing stood out, no fresh tracks, no movement in the trees. It was eerily quiet. Ellie carefully climbed into the back of the truck, checking the supplies. "There's food here," she called out, her voice carrying the relief of finding something useful. "Canned goods, some water. It's not much, but but it'll last us. Daniel's eyes scanned the road, still on high alert. We take what we can carry, but we're moving soon. As they began to gather the supplies, a faint noise reached Daniel's ears. A low growl, almost imperceptible but undeniably present. He stiffened, his senses immediately on edge. He raised his hand, signaling for the others to stop. Everyone froze. The growl grew louder, followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps. Something, or someone, was coming. And it wasn't alone. Daniel's eyes widened as he turned toward the source of the sound. Through the trees, he could make out the shapes of several figures moving toward them. They were shambling, staggering in a disjointed pattern, their heads jerking as if they were sniffing the air. Their skin was mottled and decaying, their eyes glazed over with the lifelessness that only the infected possessed. A group of infected was heading straight for them. "Run!" Daniel shouted, but it was already too late. The first of the infected stumbled into view, its grotesque features twisted in hunger. The others followed, each of them closing the distance with terrifying speed. Daniel's heart raced as he grabbed Ellie's arm and yanked her away from the truck. The group scattered, their footsteps a frantic scramble as they sprinted down the road, their hearts pounding in their chests. The infected were relentless, their movements a terrifying echo of the chaos that had engulfed the world. But the survivors weren't just running from the infected, they were running toward something. A faint glimmer of hope, hidden in the static of the world, waiting for them. And they would stop at nothing to find it. The sound of the infected's guttural growls grew louder as Daniel and the others sprinted down the road, their breath ragged, their limbs aching from the strain. The group had barely started running when the first of the infected appeared in their path, its decayed face twisted in a grotesque snarl. Behind it, a small horde was already closing in, their eyes empty but driven by an insatiable hunger. "Go!" Daniel shouted, pushing Ellie ahead of him as he glanced over his shoulder to gauge the distance between them and the infected. The others weren't far behind, but the infected were gaining ground quickly. Daniel could hear their heavy, uncoordinated footsteps pounding the earth, faster than he had expected. The road seemed to stretch on endlessly before them, offering no immediate escape. "Stay together!" Ellie called out breathlessly. Her eyes flicked from side to side, searching for anything that could offer them a chance to outrun their pursuers. The woods on either side of the road were thick, but the forest was too dense to hide in. There was nowhere to turn, nowhere to escape. The open road was their only option. They could hear the infected now, louder, closer. Their growls were so close that Daniel could almost feel their breath on his back. His heart was hammering, his legs moving on sheer instinct as he urged the group forward. "Keep moving!" Daniel shouted again, urging the survivors to pick up their pace. The others were starting to fall behind, fatigue setting in. Sarah was lagging, her breath coming in shallow bursts. Tom was the first to reach her, grabbing her arm and pulling her forward. "We have to keep going!" Tom yelled, his face contorted with a mix of determination and fear. Sarah nodded, pushing herself harder, but Daniel could see the strain on her face. She wasn't going to last much longer at this pace. Ahead, there was a break in the trees, a small gap that led to an abandoned farmhouse. It was a long shot, but it was the only possible refuge they had. "Head for the house!" Daniel shouted, his voice urgent. "Get to the building, now!" Without waiting for a response, he broke toward the farmhouse, with Ellie close on his heels. The others followed, sprinting as fast as their exhausted bodies would allow. Behind them, the infected were getting closer, too close. Daniel could hear their guttural growls, their footsteps crashing through the underbrush like a wave of destruction. There was no time to waste. They had to make it to the house before they were overrun. The farmhouse loomed closer, its weathered walls offering the faintest promise of safety. But as they neared the door, Daniel realized something that made his stomach drop. The house wasn't abandoned. A figure stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the dim light inside. It was a man, older than Daniel, wearing a weathered leather jacket and a baseball cap. He was holding a rifle, the barrel pointed toward the ground, but his posture was tense. "Get inside, quick," the man shouted, his voice sharp with urgency. Daniel didn't hesitate. He pushed Ellie toward the door, then turned to help the others. Tom and Sarah were just behind him, but Marcus had fallen behind in the chaos. The horde was getting closer. "Marcus!" Daniel yelled, reaching back to grab the older man's arm. "Come on!" Marcus turned, his face drawn with exhaustion. The sight of the oncoming infected seemed to shock him into motion, and he pushed himself forward, stumbling toward the door. As Marcus finally crossed the threshold, the man with the rifle slammed the door shut, just as the first of the infected reached the porch. There was a thud as they collided with the door, their pounding fists and twisted claws scratching at the wood. Daniel and the others were inside, breathless and terrified, their hearts still racing from the chase. The man with the rifle stood motionless, his eyes scanning them warily. "Who are you?" Daniel asked, his voice sharp. He needed to know if this man could be trusted. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he slowly lowered the rifle and wiped his brow with the back of his hand. His gaze was calculating, assessing each of them one by one. "I'm Jack," the man finally said, his voice rough but not unfriendly. "Been hiding out here for a while. Looks like you're not the first ones to come looking for shelter." He eyed the door where the infected continued to pound, their moans growing louder by the second. Daniel felt a flicker of relief, but it was fleeting. This was a temporary stop, not a safe haven. "Are there any more of them?" he asked, keeping his voice low. Jack's eyes narrowed as he looked out the window. "Not at the moment," he replied cautiously. "But there's no telling how long they'll stay away. They're attracted to sound, movement, anything that gives them a hint of life." Ellie, still panting from the sprint, wiped a hand across her forehead and looked around the interior of the farmhouse. It was modest but functional. There were a few scattered supplies, a wood stove, and what appeared to be a few survival tools hanging on the walls. It wasn't much, but it would do. "Do you have a plan?" Ellie asked, her voice strained but hopeful. "We can't stay here for long. We need to keep moving." Jack nodded, taking a seat at a small table in the corner of the room. "I've been trying to make contact with others through a radio I found," he explained, pointing to a battered old device on the table. "It's not much, but it works. There's a signal, faint, but it's there. If we're lucky, we might be able to get through to someone. Someone who can help us." Ellie exchanged a glance with Daniel. It was the same signal they had been following, the one that had led them here, to this strange, unplanned stop. "So, you think it's a real signal?" Daniel asked, his mind racing. "Not just static?" Jack gave him a tired smile. "It's hard to tell. But I've heard it a few times. I'll keep trying to reach them. If anyone's out there, they'll hear me." A spark of hope flared in Daniel's chest. This could be the chance they'd been waiting for. The chance to connect with other survivors, maybe even escape this nightmare. But before they could discuss the next steps, the unmistakable sound of the infected outside intensified. The door shuddered under their weight, and the room filled with a renewed sense of urgency. "We don't have much time," Jack said, standing up and grabbing his rifle. "If we're going to try the radio, we need to do it now." The group nodded, ready to move again. The farmhouse had given them a brief respite, but it was clear that danger was never far behind. And they would need to act quickly, before the signal they were chasing slipped away. The air in the farmhouse was thick with tension as the infected continued to slam into the door with a frightening force. Each thud echoed like a countdown, reminding the group that their time was running out. Jack moved swiftly across the room to the corner where the radio sat, an old, bulky device with static buzzing through its speakers. His hands moved with practiced ease, adjusting dials and flipping switches in a desperate attempt to make contact. Daniel, Ellie, Sarah, and Tom crowded around, their faces a mixture of hope and anxiety. The flickering light from a single lamp cast long shadows across the room, emphasizing the urgency of their situation. Outside, the growls of the infected were relentless, their hunger evident in the pounding on the door. "How long do you think we have before they break through?" Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jack didn't answer immediately, his focus entirely on the radio. He twisted the tuning knob, trying to filter out the endless waves of static that filled the air. His brow was furrowed in concentration, but it was clear that the process was wearing on him. His hands trembled slightly, whether from the exhaustion of the past few days or the growing pressure of their situation, Daniel couldn't tell. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a faint voice crackled through the static. It was barely audible at first, as if the transmission was struggling to break through the interference. "Repeat, any survivors, we hear you." The voice was barely more than a whisper, but it was there. The group froze, their eyes wide with disbelief. It was a voice, a real voice, coming from the other side. It wasn't just static after all. "Did you hear that?" Sarah gasped, her face brightening with tentative hope. "There's someone out there." Jack's fingers flew over the radio's controls as he tried to fine-tune the signal. "I can barely hear them," he muttered, adjusting the dials with precision. Come on, come on." Another burst of static, followed by a clearer, more distinct voice. It sounded urgent, almost frantic. "If anyone is out there, please respond. We're holding out in library. We can help if you reach us." The message was disjointed, breaking off in pieces, but it was enough. A library. Somewhere, someone was alive, and they were reaching out for help. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest. They had to respond, this was their chance. "Can you respond?" Ellie asked, her voice tight with anticipation. "I'm trying," Jack replied, his voice strained. He flipped several switches and pressed a button that sent a pulse of power through the radio. The static buzzed again, louder this time, and for a moment, Daniel wondered if they had lost the signal entirely. But then, through the noise, Jack's voice broke through. "This is Jack," he said, speaking into the radio. "Can anyone hear me? We are survivors. We're at the farmhouse on Route 6, near the old mill. Please, respond. We need help." For a long moment, there was silence, just the overwhelming sound of static, threatening to drown out all hope. Daniel held his breath, staring at Jack, willing the signal to break through. Then, suddenly, the voice returned. "Jack, Route 6, we hear you." It was clearer now, the voice full of relief. "We're on our way, stay put, we're coming to get you." The room erupted in a collective sigh of relief. Daniel felt his body slacken in exhaustion, the weight of the chase and the pressure of survival lifting just slightly. But they weren't out of danger yet. "Are they close?" Tom asked, his eyes wide with disbelief. The voice on the other end crackled again. "We're still a few hours out, hold tight, don't engage the infected, stay hidden." The transmission faltered again, but the message was clear, help was coming. The group exchanged looks, a wave of cautious optimism spreading through them. They had a chance now, a real chance. Jack quickly turned off the radio, his hands shaking slightly as he wiped his forehead with the back of his sleeve. "We've got a window," he said, his voice firm. "We stay quiet, stay hidden, and wait for them to arrive. No more fighting. We don't have the strength for that." Daniel nodded, but a gnawing feeling remained at the back of his mind. What if they don't make it in time? Jack's face hardened, his jaw tightening. "Then we fight. We run. We do whatever we have to do." It was clear to everyone in the room that the window of safety was small. The infected were growing restless outside, and the pounding on the door was becoming more frantic. The group could hear them growling, their frustration palpable, as they tried to break through to the survivors. But inside, there was a moment of quiet, a brief lull in the chaos. "What now?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. Daniel looked around at the others, seeing the weariness in their eyes. "We wait," he said. "But we stay ready." The group moved to the back of the farmhouse, finding whatever supplies they could. Jack had already stocked up on water and canned goods, and now the survivors settled into a small, dimly lit room. There were a few old mattresses, and the faint smell of mildew lingered in the air, but it was a safe haven, for now. Ellie, her face pale and drawn, sat on one of the mattresses, clutching a small radio in her hands. She kept her eyes on the door, her expression tense as the group tried to settle in. Daniel moved to the window, peering through the cracked glass. The forest beyond was silent, almost too silent. The infected had stopped trying to break down the door for the moment, but it felt like the calm before a storm. "We stay quiet," Daniel said softly, turning to face the others. "And we stay prepared. They're coming, but we don't know how long we'll have before we need to move." The radio flickered again, static crackling from the corner. Daniel quickly moved to it, hoping it was another transmission. But this time, there was only a sharp burst of static. "Come on," he muttered, his fingers hovering over the radio. The team was depending on it, and they couldn't afford to lose contact now. The tension in the room mounted as the minutes stretched into what felt like hours, the infected outside stirring, the world waiting on the edge of a razor-sharp cliff. The only thing they knew for sure was this: they were no longer alone. But whether that would be enough to save them remained to be seen. 8. The air inside the farmhouse was thick with a sense of urgency. The infected outside had quieted for the moment, but every passing second felt like an eternity. The survivors had huddled together in the dim light, waiting, listening for any sound that might signal the arrival of help or the approach of more danger. The radio crackled in the corner, but nothing had come through for a while. Jack kept his hands on the device, ready to react at the first sign of a new transmission. Daniel paced back and forth, his mind racing. Time was running out. They had no idea how much longer the radio would stay operational, and they certainly didn't know how much longer the infected would be content to stay outside. Ellie sat near the window, her eyes scanning the distant horizon. Her fingers nervously twitched at the edges of her sleeves, her thoughts clearly as torn as the rest of them. She was exhausted, physically and mentally, and it showed. Yet, her determination to survive was unmistakable. "Jack, how long do we wait?" Daniel finally asked, his voice laced with concern. "How long do we stay in this farmhouse, hoping they'll make it here?" Jack didn't respond immediately, his eyes fixed on the radio in front of him. The silence between them stretched on, thick and uncomfortable. Finally, Jack turned to face Daniel, his expression tight but resolute. "As long as we have to," he said, his voice steady. "If they said they're coming, they're coming. We just need to hold out. But we can't make a move without knowing for sure." Daniel nodded, but a gnawing feeling in his gut refused to let him rest. They couldn't afford to wait forever, and the infected were still out there, lurking, waiting for the smallest hint of weakness to strike. Ellie stood up suddenly, her eyes wide as she caught something out of the corner of her eye. She glanced at the others, then moved cautiously to the window. "Wait," she whispered, holding up a hand. "Look." The group crowded around the window, straining to see what Ellie had spotted. At first, all they could see was the barren stretch of land surrounding the farmhouse. But then, faint against the horizon, a dust cloud appeared, growing larger with each passing second. "They're here," Jack murmured, his voice tinged with relief. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. It was them, the survivors from the radio. The dust cloud grew larger, and soon the faint shapes of vehicles began to materialize. A convoy. It was slow, moving cautiously, but it was coming toward them. "They're really coming," Sarah breathed, her voice a mixture of disbelief and hope. But as the convoy drew closer, the sense of relief started to give way to another, more pressing thought. The convoy wasn't alone. Behind the vehicles, several figures staggered across the field, their movement erratic and disjointed. Infected. A horde was trailing the convoy, moving in jerky, mindless motion, but rapidly gaining ground. "They don't see them," Tom muttered, his eyes wide with panic. "They don't see the infected." Jack's face hardened as he grabbed the rifle off the wall. "We need to warn them. Now." Without another word, he darted for the door, but Daniel grabbed his arm. "Wait!" Daniel hissed, pulling him back. "If we go out there, they'll see us. We're just as exposed as they are." "We can't just let them walk into that," Jack replied, his jaw clenched. "We have to help them. We can't let them fall into that trap." Daniel's eyes darted to the window again, his thoughts racing. The convoy was only a few hundred yards away now, but they were dangerously close to the infected horde. "We have to make a decision," Daniel said, his voice tight. "We can't risk running out there, exposing ourselves. But we can't let them get overwhelmed." Ellie's voice came softly from behind him. "If we don't do something, they'll all be dead. We can't let that happen." Daniel turned to look at her. She was right. They couldn't just sit here and watch the convoy get overrun, not when they had a chance to save lives. He knew the odds were slim, but they had no choice. "We'll have to go out there," Daniel said, his decision final. "But we do it carefully. We wait until the infected move toward the convoy, then we make our move. We'll get as close as we can and warn them before they're trapped." The group exchanged tense looks. They knew it was a risky plan, but it was the only one they had. With the infected closing in on the convoy, they had no time to waste. Jack grabbed his rifle and nodded. "Let's go. We do this quietly. We're not making a sound unless we absolutely have to." The group filed out of the farmhouse, stepping cautiously into the tall grass that surrounded the property. They kept low, moving as quickly as they could without drawing attention. The convoy was still moving toward them, the distant sound of engines rumbling in the quiet air. The infected, oblivious to the humans nearby, were too focused on the convoy to notice the survivors sneaking through the field. As they crept closer, Daniel's heart pounded in his chest. The convoy was within reach now, but the infected were closing in. There was no time left. "On my signal," Daniel whispered. "We run." The others nodded, their faces grim with determination. They were ready. Daniel waited until the last moment. The infected were less than 50 yards away from the convoy now, their moans growing louder with each passing second. As the first few figures in the convoy came into sight, Daniel's pulse raced. "Go!" he shouted, his voice sharp in the tense silence. The group sprinted forward, dodging infected as they moved quickly but quietly toward the convoy. In the distance, the figures in the convoy were now close enough for Daniel to see that they had heard the commotion. They were turning around, realizing the threat was closing in. The survivors in the convoy started to move, desperate to avoid the oncoming horde. "Shout to them!" Ellie yelled, her voice cutting through the tension. "Tell them to move." Daniel turned, spotting one of the convoy leaders, a tall man with dark hair and a makeshift arm guard, looking in their direction. He held up his hands, signaling for the convoy to stop. "We've got to move faster." Daniel shouted at the man. "The infected are right behind you." The convoy leader's eyes widened as he understood the situation. He turned and yelled, signaling to his group to move quickly. The convoy, now fully aware of the danger, began to race toward the farmhouse, the sound of engines roaring in the distance. It was a moment of chaos, but a moment of victory. The infected were too close, but the survivors were quick, and Daniel felt a surge of hope. For the first time in a long time, he felt like they were no longer alone in the world. The convoy pulled into the safety of the farmhouse, and the door slammed shut behind them, just as the infected reached the field. It had been a close call, but they had made it. Now, all they had to do was survive together. And maybe, just maybe, there was hope for them after all.